"You need a woman like me," Apache woman said to the cowboy that had saved her life. Noonlight fell hard across Eagle Ridge Valley, the kind of white heat that scraped the land bare. Marshall Pierce pulled his horse to a stop when a sharp cry echoed from the dry creek bed below. In the glare of dust and sun, he saw three men driving a woman and a young boy into a corner of broken rock. The woman stood in front, knife raised, shoulder steady despite the tremor in her breath. The boy pressed against her back, trying to be brave, too small to understand how fast death could come in this valley. Marshall fired a warning shot. The men scattered, boots kicking up red dust as they vanished into the ridge. Silence dropped heavy. He rode down slowly, not wanting to startle them. "You all right?" he asked. The woman met his eyes measured, unafraid, assessing him as if her life depended on it. Then she spoke, her English rough but certain. "You need a woman like me. I can work. And I just need a shelter." The bluntness struck him harder than the heat. For the first time in months, Marshall let out a quiet, genuine laugh. And that was how everything began. Before we continue the story, take a moment to comment below and tell me where you're watching from and why Wild West love stories speak to you. Your thoughts help this tale reach the folks who truly feel its heartbeat. The trail toward Bear Ridge Ranch wound through a valley carved by wind more than water. Heat shimmered above the limestone ridges, turning the air into wavering sheets of silver. Juniper trees clung to the slopes like survivors who refused to let the desert claim them. As Marshall led the woman and her boy across the open land, the only sounds were the creak of leather, the distant hum of cicadas, and the dry whisper of dust rolling under their boots. Eagle Ridge Valley was a lonely place. Folks said you could hear your own heartbeat on nights without wind, and sometimes that silence felt heavier than any storm. Marshall knew that truth too well. Bear Ridge, a stretch of weathered pasture and two-room cabin, had become more tomb than home since Catherine passed. He had built a life there out of habit, not purpose, tending his cattle as if routine could patch the hollow inside him. The woman kept pace beside him without complaint, even injured or exhausted. She carried herself like someone who refused to be small. Her name, when she finally offered it, came soft but clear. Kiana. A simple word, yet it seemed to hold all the grit and quiet fire of the land they walked. Her hair fell in loose waves down her back, sun-darkened and tangled from days of running. A smear of dust streaked her cheek, but it did nothing to dull the sharp beauty in her eyes that watched everything, that listened even when she appeared still. Her clothes were worn, stitched many times over by hands that knew how to survive with little. And though she walked lightly, Marshall sensed the guarded tension in her shoulders, a woman prepared to defend herself if kindness turned into something else. The boy stayed close to her, but every few steps he glanced at Marshall's horse with a curiosity he tried to hide. "Darren," she murmured when Marshall asked his name. The child was perhaps 10, maybe younger. It was hard to tell when hardship carved lines into a face before its time. He held a small leather pouch tight against his chest, like something precious and fragile lived inside. As they approached the ranch, the scent of sun-baked timber and dust rising off the corral greeted them. The cabin stood modest against the horizon, made of thick logs that had weathered 12 winters and twice as many storms. It was not a place meant to impress, just a place meant to endure. Marshall dismounted with a muted groan, the ache in his shoulder flaring again. He tried to hide it, out of habit more than pride. But Kiana noticed anyway. Her gaze narrowed briefly, an unspoken question. Or perhaps calculation. She didn't ask. She simply followed him to the porch, her steps light, her presence unsettling the silence he had worn like armor. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of old wood and the faint lingering of smoke from last night's fire. Marshall struck a match to brighten the room, suddenly aware of how empty it looked to strangers, how empty his life must appear to anyone who entered it. Kiana took it all in with one slow sweep of her eyes. And for the first time in years, Marshall felt the weight of being seen. Rain had not touched Eagle Ridge Valley in nearly 6 weeks. Yet the scent of storms lingered in the air as Marshall pushed open the cabin door. Kiana stepped inside ahead of him, Darren trailing like a shadow stitched to her ankles. The boy's fingers brushed the doorway before he entered, as if asking permission from a place he did not yet trust. The cabin interior was dim, except for a thin slant of light cutting through the small window. Dust motes drifted in it like wandering sparks. Marshall watched Kiana move slow, deliberate, the way someone walked through unfamiliar territory. Her eyes scanned everything: the pot on the stove, the single chair at the table, the rifle leaning against the wall, the folded blanket at the foot of the bed. She wasn't judging, she was learning the space, committing it to whatever survival map she carried inside. "You can sit," Marshall said quietly, more suggestion than command. Kiana didn't sit. Instead, she looked at his shoulder, the stiffness in the way he moved, the way he pressed his left hand against his ribs without realizing it. She set her knife on the table, not in surrender but in practicality. Then opened the leather pouch Darren had clutched so tightly. "I fixed this," she said, nodding toward his injury. Marshall hesitated. Letting someone tend to him was something he hadn't done since Catherine. But the ache in his shoulder throbbed like a drumbeat, and Kiana's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had stitched wounds long before they reached him. "It's just a scrape," he muttered. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Only men say just, even when blood does not stop." Darren watched with wide, unblinking eyes as Marshall sank into the lone chair. Kiana moved with practiced efficiency. She rolled back his sleeve, revealing the raw line of torn flesh. Her fingers were cool, steady. She crushed herbs with the flat of her knife, mixing them with a small amount of water in a wooden bowl. The scent rose sharply pungent, earthy, alive. Marshall tried not to flinch when she pressed the mixture to his skin. "Burns," he said through clenched teeth. "Means it works." Her tone was gentle but undeniable. For a moment, silence settled over them, thick, almost shaped. Marshall could feel her breath on his neck, smell the faint smoke in her hair. Something wild and worn, but not broken. He had not been this close to another soul in years, had not allowed himself to be. The intimacy was unexpected, disarming. Darren stepped closer, curiosity overpowering caution. "He's strong," the boy whispered in a voice barely meant to be heard. Kiana tied the cloth with decisive knots. "Strong is not good if he is foolish," she said softly, though her eyes flickered toward Marshall with something warmer than reprimand. He almost smiled. When she finished, Kiana stepped back, reclaiming her space. Marshall rose slowly, testing the bandage. "Thank you," he said. 2 simple words, but they carried weight. Gratitude was not something he offered lightly. Kiana nodded once. "We work for shelter. You give. We give." Her English was direct, stripped of decoration, but her meaning was unmistakable. He studied her for a long moment. She stood tall despite exhaustion, a survivor carved into the shape of a woman. She asked for shelter as a trade, not charity. It made Marshall's chest ache with something unfamiliar respect. Perhaps. Or the first flicker of trust. Darren wandered toward the window, watching the land outside with an expression that mixed longing and fear. The boy touched the rifle leaning against the wall, fingertips barely grazing the wood. "Careful with that," Marshall said gently. Darren jerked his hand back, eyes wide. Marshall softened his tone. "One day you'll hold one proper, not today." Something like pride brightened the boy's face before he quickly hid it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the low hum of distant thunder across the valley. Trouble was moving closer. Marshall could feel it in the pressure of the air, in the way Kiana's shoulders tensed ever so slightly. Their worlds had collided out of necessity. But as the three of them stood in the small cabin, one man, one woman, one child, Marshall sensed that something larger had begun to take shape between them. Something none of them had planned for. Something none of them could yet name. Morning in Eagle Ridge Valley began not with birdsong, but with wind brushing across the dry grass, lifting the cool night air before the sun burned it away. Marshall stepped out onto the porch just as the horizon blushed pink. Behind him, the cabin was no longer silent. There were quiet sounds, cloth moving, soft footsteps, the faint crackle of Kiana stirring the embers back to life, sounds he hadn't heard inside that house in years. Darren sat in the patch of early light outside, studying Marshall's horse with the reverent curiosity only children possessed. The Mustang flicked its ears, sensing the boy's fascination. Darren didn't touch, didn't crowd, he simply watched, as if memorizing how a creature that strong could stand so calmly. "You want to help with the feed?" Marshall asked. The boy looked to Kiana first. She gave a tiny nod, permission, trust, or simply acknowledgement that Darren needed to learn something of this world if he was to survive it. Darren stood instantly and followed Marshall to the barn. His steps were light, deliberate, as though he worried he might break the moment if he moved too quickly. Inside the barn, the air was sweet with the scent of hay and dust. Marshall showed him how to check the troughs, how to run his palm over the horse's flank so it wouldn't startle. "Gentle," he murmured. "The world gives enough reasons to fear. Don't add another." Darren tried the motion, hesitant at first. When the horse didn't recoil, his face lit with a quiet triumph. Marshall felt something warm unfurl in his chest, a feeling he had buried beside Catherine, thinking it would never return. From the porch, Kiana watched them. The morning light softened her features, turning the stern lines of survival into something almost tender. There was something in the way she observed Marshall guiding her son, something that tugged at the space between gratitude and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Later, she joined him in the barn. She carried a torn bridle strap in her hands. "This broke," she said simply. Marshall took it, brushing his fingers lightly over the frayed leather. "I can fix it." "I fix," she corrected, and reached for his tools. Her confidence surprised him. She pulled the needle through with practiced movements, every stitch even and strong. Marshall leaned against the stall door, watching her hands, strong hands, scarred in places, yet steady. The kind of hands that had kept her and Darren alive long before they reached him. "You've done this before," he said softly. Kiana didn't look up, many times. Horses do not care if you are woman or man, only if you treat them with respect. He found himself smiling. Sound advice for people too. She paused at that, eyes lifting to meet his. The moment hung between them, brief but charged, like the breath before a storm changes direction. Inside the cabin, the days settled into a rhythm Marshall had forgotten people could share. Kiana cooked simple meals, herbs and corn mashed with a quiet patience. She mended clothes, rearranged small things without asking, making the cabin feel less like a shell and more like a place meant for living. Marshall felt the shift each time he stepped through the door. In the evenings, Darren sat by the fire while Marshall taught him how to whittle wood into small shapes. The boy listened intently, rarely speaking, but when he did, his voice carried a softness that reminded Marshall how fragile strength could be in a child. Sometimes Kiana joined them, sitting close enough that he could sense the heat of her presence, but not close enough to touch. Marshall found himself listening for the sound of her steps, watching the way she braided her hair in the mornings, noticing how she tilted her head when she searched for distant riders. These were small things, almost nothing at all, yet each one carved its own mark inside him. But trust was not a simple thing. One evening as the sun dipped behind the valley ridge, Marshall stepped out to find Kiana alone, staring toward the distant mountains. Her shoulders were tense, expression unreadable in the shifting light. "You're looking for something," he said quietly. "No," she answered, though her voice carried a heaviness he couldn't ignore. "I am listening to what? To danger." Her gaze shifted to him. "It follows." Marshall stepped beside her. Their arms did not touch, but he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Cole won't get this close," he said. "You don't know him." Her voice trembled not with fear, but with memory. "Then tell me," Marshall said gently. She hesitated. He could feel her weighing the risk of letting words undo everything she had built around herself. But eventually she spoke. "My husband, he found silver, small, but enough for Cole to want. He said no. Cole killed him, made it look like he never came home." Her jaw clenched. "Darren saw the body before I could hide him." Marshall's breath caught. The boy's quiet, watchful nature suddenly made painful sense. Kiana continued, voice low. "Cole said I would follow, that he would finish what he started." Marshall's hands tightened at his sides. "Not here," he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. "Not with me." Kiana looked at him, then really looked. Something softened at the edges of her gaze, a fragile opening that could vanish with the wrong word. But Marshall didn't push. He simply stayed beside her as the valley darkened, letting the silence settle around them like a shared promise. That night, when Darren fell asleep, wrapped in blankets near the fire, Kiana lingered by the doorway. Marshall was repairing a loose plank on the porch. She stepped closer, her shadow merging with his in the flickering light. "You help us," she said quietly. "No one has helped for a long time." Marshall met her eyes. Maybe no one tried hard enough. A small breath escaped her, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but something warmer than either. It lingered between them as she turned back inside, leaving Marshall alone with the fading glow of the lantern and a strange thought he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. He didn't want the night to end without her voice in it. The sky over Eagle Ridge Valley carried a heaviness that did not belong to summer. All afternoon the wind had been wrong too sharp, too cold at the edges, as if it had rolled down from the high country with a warning clenched in its fists. Marshall felt it first, that subtle shift in pressure that made the air harder to breathe. Kiana felt it too. She paused mid-step outside the barn, eyes narrowing toward the far horizon where bands of iron-gray clouds were stacking fast. "Storm," she murmured. Marshall glanced up. "A bad one." The wind picked up, scattering dust across the yard. It carried something else with it, tracks. Fresh. Boot prints curving around the corral. Too close. Too deliberate. Marshall knelt to examine them, feeling the faint pulse of danger throb at the base of his neck. "Cole's men," he said. Kiana came beside him, her breath tight. "They found us." Marshall rose, already moving. "Inside, we don't have much time." The three of them worked as if driven by instinct. Marshall hauled wooden planks to reinforce the windows. Kiana gathered water, blankets, the little they could carry if they needed to flee. Darren helped without a word, his face pale but resolute. The boy's hands trembled only once when thunder cracked open the sky so loudly he flinched. Marshall placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You stay close to your mother," he said. "You hear me?" Darren nodded, jaw tight with effort. By dusk, the storm had descended. Rain slashed across the valley in horizontal sheets, stinging like thrown gravel. Lightning strobed the land in violent flashes, each one revealing shapes moving in the dark riders creeping toward the ranch. The sky growled, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of thunder. Marshall lifted his rifle. "They're using the storm for cover." Kiana's eyes burned with a fierce clarity. "Then we see them by lightning." The first bullet shattered the window frame, splintering wood into the room. Darren gasped and dropped to the floor. Marshall shoved Kiana behind the wall before firing a clean shot into the storm. The muzzle flash lit the rain, briefly outlining a rider slipping from his saddle. "Back door," Kiana warned, already moving. A shadow crashed through the rear frame, soaked and snarling. The man lunged with a knife, but Kiana met him head-on. Her blade flashed silver in the lightning, her movement swift and unhesitating. She drove her shoulder into his chest, spun, and struck. The man collapsed at her feet as thunder swallowed his last cry. Marshall barely had time to register the kill when another shot rang out, this one from outside. "Aim low," Darren cried out, clutching his arm as blood spread across his sleeve. Kiana's voice cracked, not with fear for herself, but fear for him. Marshall slid across the floor to the boy, dragging him behind the heavy table. "Let me see," he said, heart hammering hard enough to bruise his ribs. The bullet had grazed Darren's arm, deep enough to bleed, not deep enough to kill. But the sight of it, of a child's blood on his hands, ripped open something inside Marshall. A memory he had buried under stone and silence. Catherine's fevered breath, the helplessness, the grave he had dug alone. He forced the memory back and tied a strip of cloth around Darren's arm with steady hands. "You're all right. You're brave. Stay low." Kiana fired 2 clean shots from the kitchen doorway, her stance unshakable despite fear twisting her features. Marshall met her eyes. In that moment, every wall they had built between them fell. Not lovers, not strangers, just 2 people fighting for the same soul. "You hold them from the left," Marshall said. "I'll cover the right." She nodded, her breath steadier now that Darren was safe beside them. "We finish this together." Together. The word lodged in Marshall's chest like an anchor. The storm raged harder, turning the world into a blur of rain, lightning, and gunfire, a dead cottonwood, its roots loosened by the storm, cracked and toppled onto one of the attackers. The scream was brief before it was swallowed by thunder. By the time the shooting slowed, 3 bodies lay still in the mud outside. The remaining men pulled back, shouting to one another over the roar of the storm. Cole would regroup. He always did. But not tonight. Inside the cabin, the aftermath settled like dust. Rain drummed on the roof in heavy, relentless sheets. Marshall sank onto the floor beside Darren, checking his pulse, his breathing, the color of his skin. The boy was pale, but alive. Kiana knelt too, fingers trembling as she touched Darren's cheek. Relief washed through her in a wave so strong she had to close her eyes. When she opened them, Marshall was watching her, really watching. "You kept him alive," she whispered. "You kept me alive," he answered, voice low. Lightning illuminated her face, showing the tear she hadn't meant to shed. Marshall reached up, brushing it away with the back of his knuckles, a touch that lingered half a second longer than necessity allowed. Between them, something shifted, something deep, something that had waited for a crack in the storm to slip through. "Marshall," she said softly, almost a warning. "We'll protect him," he replied. "Both of us." The cabin creaked under the storm's weight, and Darren stirred between them, reminding them what mattered. Kiana leaned her forehead lightly against Marshall's for a suspended breath, neither pulling away nor pushing forward, just existing in the fragile space carved by fear and survival. Outside, rain washed blood from the dirt. Inside, the storm inside them both had found its breaking point, and by dawn, nothing between them would ever be the same. Dawn crept into Eagle Ridge Valley on muted feet, as if wary of disturbing what the night had done. The storm clouds had broken into long streaks of pale gold, stretching over the hills like healing scars. The land still smelled of rain-wet earth, crushed sage, and the faint iron tang of blood the storm could not wash away. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, throwing a soft amber glow across the room. Darren slept bundled in blankets near the hearth, his breathing slow and even. Kiana had watched over him through the night, refusing to rest until his fever eased and the color returned to his cheeks. Only when the storm finally died did she allow herself to sag against the wall, exhaustion settling over her bones like dust. Marshall stepped quietly into the room, having checked the yard, the corral, the barn, everything a man checked when danger wasn't done with him yet. He leaned the rifle against the table and looked at Kiana. She sat cross-legged, hands resting on her knees, eyes heavy-lidded but alert, always alert. "Cole's men are gone," Marshall said softly, "for now." Kiana exhaled, long and slow. She didn't thank him. She knew as well as he did that the night had been a shared fight, not a rescue. What she offered instead was a quiet nod, a gesture that carried more weight between them than a dozen spoken words. Marshall lowered himself beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The heat from the hearth warmed his skin, but it was her nearness he felt more keenly. He glanced at her hands, calloused, steady, stained faintly with Darren's blood and her own. Hands of a survivor, hands he had come to admire. "You were fearless last night," he murmured. She turned her head slightly. "Fearless is not truth. I felt fear. But fear is not enemy. Running is." He absorbed her words. They felt like something he needed to hear, even if he didn't know why. For a moment they watched Darren together, in a silence that felt strangely tender. Outside, a breeze lifted the scent of rain into the cabin, stirring the curtains. It wasn't often the valley smelled clean. Not often it felt like anything could start over. "Marshall," Kiana said quietly. He looked at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. She hesitated, words gathering like small, fragile stones on the edge of a cliff. "You help us," she said. "Many men. They see Apache woman, Apache child, and turn away. Or worse. She swallowed. The movement small but sharp. You did not. Maybe it's because I've run from enough ghosts myself. He answered. Maybe I was tired of having no one to stand for. Her eyes flickered. You stand for us now. He nodded. No hesitation. Yes, I do. Kiana studied him, searching for the crack where lies usually lived. She found none. That truth, naked and steady in his voice, tugged something deep inside her chest, something that frightened her more than the storm. You have your own wounds, she said softly. I see them, not on your skin. Marshall's breath hitched. Catherine's memory rose like a shadow her fever. The helplessness, the grave he had dug with shaking hands. He blinked hard. I lost my wife, he said, voice rough. Lost myself after. Thought the silence would keep me steady. He swallowed, but it just kept me hollow. Kiana listened, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She reached out, placing her hand lightly on his forearm. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. Marshall froze not from discomfort, but from the unfamiliar ache of wanting more. Silence is not home, she whispered. People make home. Marshall stared at her strength, at the way the firelight softened the hard angles grief had carved into her face. He lifted his hand, brushing away a strand of hair stuck to her cheek from the night's rain. The gesture was slow, careful a question, not an answer. Kiana, he murmured. She didn't pull away. You don't have to leave, he said. His voice was quiet but certain, the certainty of a man no longer afraid of wanting. Not because you need shelter. You stay because He paused, breath unsteady. Because I need you here. Kiana closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of his words. When she opened them, something warm lived in her gaze, a fragile, hesitant hope she had not let herself feel in years. Then we stay, she said, her voice only a breath. If you want us. He exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening like a knot undone. I do, he whispered. Outside, the valley brightened, the storm-washed world taking its first breath of morning. Inside the cabin, two people who had spent years running from their own ghosts sat shoulder to shoulder in the quiet, letting the space between them shift into something new, something worth fighting for. By late afternoon, the valley felt too still. No wind, no bird call, only the slow crawl of heat settling back over Eagle Ridge after the storm. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, it warned. Marshall felt it before he saw anything, a tightening in the chest, a prickle at the base of his neck. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Kiana joined him without a word, her knife tucked at her hip, her posture taut and ready. Barrett Cole appeared first, riding hard across the flats with two remaining men at his side. His coat was soaked, his face scraped, but his arrogance rode ahead of him like a banner. You think you can hide an Apache woman from me? Cole shouted as he reined in. Think a washed-up rancher's gonna change anything? Marshall stepped off the porch, meeting him halfway across the yard. You've taken enough from her boy. It ends here, Cole sneered. You want to die for her? Pierce, I want to live with them, Marshall answered, steady as bedrock. Cole drew first. The shot cracked the air, missing Marshall by inches. Marshall fired back one precise round that knocked Cole's revolver from his hand. The two riders charged, but Kiana was already moving. She darted low through the dust, blade flashing like lightning, One man toppled from his saddle before he even understood he'd been struck. The second fell to Marshall's shot a heartbeat later. Cole, wounded but wild with desperation, lunged at Kiana. She met him head-on, twisting past his reach, driving her knife into his shoulder. The impact staggered him long enough for Marshall to step forward and end it with a final clean shot. The valley went quiet once more. Not the threatening quiet from before, this was the kind that followed closure. When the sheriff arrived hours later, Marshall told him everything. Abram Tate believed him. He always had. Cole's body, Cole's crimes, and Cole's greed were finally laid bare for good. As evening settled, Marshall, Kiana, and Darren stood together outside the cabin. The storm had washed the land clean. The sky burned orange and gold, painting the ridge with the colors of a world being remade. Darren slipped his hand into Marshall's. Kiana stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm, and for the first time in years, Bear Ridge was no longer a place of silence, but a home where three wounded hearts chose to stay.